about your confidentiality, we ask that you please talk to me offline and consider maybe abstaining from joining, because unfortunately we will have a situation where your name could be appearing, and we don't want to violate any POPI regulations in the government. So please, if you are unhappy that this is going to be a recorded event that will be put on Facebook and YouTube, please be informed. Please switch off your microphone and your video. Right. So welcome everybody. Today we have Dr. Zuhair Kafar from Stellenbosch University. He was born on the Cape Flats in Athlone and moved to Mitchells Plain with his parents in the 1980s. He attended Parkhurst Primary School, Mondale Secondary School, and Oaklands Senior Secondary. After failing his first year of his misguided BSc degree at UCT in 1991, he returned to UWC to complete a degree in English and psychology. After completing his honors degree in psychology, he obtained a master's degree in research psychology at the University of the Western Cape in 2005. In December 2015, he graduated with his PhD in psychology from the University of Stellenbosch. Zuhair has been a lecturer in the Department of Psychology at Stellenbosch University since 2007. Where he teaches research methods, lectures, psychological measurement, and supervises postgraduate research. He received the Director's Award for Excellence in Research in 2010. He has recently been promoted to senior lecturer. He has published 22 peer-reviewed articles, contributed to chapters in 3 books, submitted 10 client research reports, and has 16 conference papers and 12 conference posters in which he has either authored or co-authored. He also regularly reviews articles, the most recent review being with the Age and Behavior and Transcultural Psychiatry Journal. In addition, he has supervised 9 master's theses, 1 PhD thesis to completion, and has examined 15 theses and 2 doctoral theses. Thank you so much for joining us today, Doctor. We welcome you, and you may go ahead and capacitate us to be better researchers. Someone muted you, so if you could please unmute yourself, Dr. Kafar. Okay. Teresa, sorry, my dear, but your video is still on. Teresa, if you could please switch off your video. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. You can start.
Okay. Teresa, your video is still on. You could switch that off, it would save bandwidth. Yeah. Yes, Teresa. Your video is on. If you could switch that off, please. Okay, so welcome. I don't think that I'm going to make any give you any sort of epiphanies today. At the same time, I'm also a little bit anxious looking at the list of names because there's a few that I recognize as colleagues. But yeah, today we're going to talk. Teresa, in the top right-hand side next to your microphone is a little camera icon. Just click on that and it will put your video on. If you're working from your computer. Thank you. Okay, so today we're talking about deciding on what you want to know and how to get to know. I was asked to do this talk about quantitative research questions and just give me a second.
We can't hear you, sir.
You
it's
can't
like
hear
you are
me.
muted.
No, his audio is clear on my side. Can you please check that your data connection is working on your side, please?
Can everybody hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I was invited to do a talk today on quantitative research questions, hypothesis development, and research designs. And I thought that's quite a boring title. And so I've changed it to deciding on what you want to know and how to get to know it, because that's essentially what research is about. What is it you want to know, and how are you going to get the answer to your question? And we'll talk about that in more detail a little later. So we're working within the realm of quantitative research with numbers. And so I see that you have already had qualitative research. So I'm not going to go into the difference between qualitative and quantitative research. Or maybe I should just spend a few minutes on that. With quantitative research, we're dealing with an ontological stance that there is a external reality that we can access through numbers. So for example, if we use the example of depression, within this ontological stance, we are able to say, sorry, I'm just getting distracted by that message in the chat. Yes, if you have questions, please just raise your hand under the actions and then I'll answer immediately. So your ontological assumption is that, for example, depression exists out there in reality somehow, and we can access your level of depression by asking you a series of questions, which we then give a number to, and then that number is a reflection of your level of depression. So there's this external thing that exists that we can access through numbers. So I want to start by saying that within quantitative research, we, in the social sciences, generally work with scales, instruments, like continuing the theme of depression, we'll work with something like Beck's depression inventory, or we would work for diagnosis. We could use something like the SCID, the SCID, the structured clinical interview for diagnosis, and those are all numbers based. So what I want to get to next is, well, what can we answer with quantitative questions? Well, I'm going to continue with the theme of depression because it's, I think, something that it's easier to understand, and anybody that has some other concepts we can talk about will please feel welcome to raise your hand and ask about that particular example. But I'm going to use the example of depression throughout this presentation. So, for example, one of the things that we can ask about depression is, what is the prevalence of depression in South Africa? How many people in South Africa suffer from depression? What we can't answer with quantitative questions are things like, what does it feel like for somebody to live with depression? And that would be a qualitative question. So if you want to know about the lived experience of people, then quantitative research isn't able to answer that. But if you want to know what the level of depression is in South Africa, or if you want to know for a particular group of individuals what their levels of depression are, and you want to relate it to something else, then that is what a quantitative research question can answer. So I want to ask if anybody else has a research question that they want to share that we can then work through? Or shall I continue with depression?
You may continue with depression, I think.
Thank you, Beauty. So I'll continue with the idea of depression as a concept. So let's, for example, say that using my first example, I want to know what the level of depression is amongst, let's say, CISA members. I want to determine from CISA members what the level, what the prevalence of depression is amongst CISA members. So, Hasina, I agree. It's something that is close to my heart, and you can go on my Facebook page and you'll see why. So, if I want to know what's the prevalence of depression among CISA members, I first need to decide on, well, there's this concept called depression that we all have an idea of what it might be individually, but for your research, you would need to come up with a conceptual definition. So this is my concept, depression. This is my definition for my research of what depression is. And so I'm going to ask people just to unmute themselves and just call out. In terms of another concept, so determining depression's definition, what would be another concept that you can add to depression? So let's start with somebody who is depressed is.
Sad.
Somebody who's depressed is sad, yes.
Not enjoying life.
But there was an echo there, so I couldn't hear you.
Not enjoying anything they do.
Yeah, so not enjoying, they feel sad, they don't enjoy anything they do. What
Helpless.
else? Sorry?
Helpless.
Helpless, they feel helpless, yeah.
Hopeless.
And hopeless. Let's just keep those four. So those are concepts in their own, right? Sad, not enjoying anything they do, which in psychology we call anhedonia. Hopeless, and what was the other one, Beauty?
Helplessness.
Helpless. Okay. So those are concepts. So we can say that in terms of what our research is going to do, we're defining depression as those four things. So for the psychologists in here, if we are doing this with depression, you would need to come up with some conceptual definition that fits either the ICD-10 or the DSM-5 definitions of what depression is. But let's say, for example, for argument's sake, that we've now come up with a conceptual definition of depression. What we then need to do is we need to operationalize that definition. So we know what the concept is. It's hopelessness, sadness, helplessness, anhedonia. Those are the four things that we use as our conceptual definition. How are we going to measure those things? How are we going to measure sadness? How are we going to measure hopelessness? How are we going to measure helplessness? How are we going to measure anhedonia? Those four concepts. Is there something that exists that measures those things? And generally, in the world of psychological measurement, there are dozens of measures of depression. From screening tools like the Beck Depression Inventory to the Edinburgh postnatal depression scale that's very specific for pre and postnatal depression, to the gold standard, which would be the structured clinical interview for diagnosis, the SCID, which will actually give you a diagnosis of depression. So for our four concepts, the conceptual definitions are definitions using using other concepts to define it. We now need to move to, okay, how are we going to measure that? And that will give us our operational definition. So how do we measure sadness? How are we going to measure that? Well, because we're dealing with the numbers, we want to be able to give a number to that, right? So we'll operationalize sadness with either one or a number of questions relating to how the person feels. For the psychologists, that would be their affect. We talk about ABC in psychology: affect, behavior, and cognitions. So how do they feel? Their emotions, they feel sad. Their helplessness, how do we measure that? Yes, how often do you feel sad? We could have a range from never to once a month, once a week, every day. And then in terms of helplessness falls under the B of our affect, behavior, and cognitions. So their behavior, they actually it's still feelings. The affect of feeling helplessness. The affect of feeling hopeless. And then the behavior is the anhedonia, the inability to find pleasure in things that they found pleasure in before. So we'll have to come up with individual questions to answer those four concepts that we've identified as our conceptual definition. Now, depression has been widely researched extensively for a long time. It's one of the most well-researched topics in psychology. And so there are many scales, and then there are the gold standard of scales where you can actually get a diagnosis. So we've now moved from our conceptual definition to our operationalized definition. So now we have a operational definition of how we're going to measure it, how we're going to transform our conceptual definition into a operationalized definition. How, from identifying the concept to how we're going to measure this concept that we've identified. So once we have an operationalized definition, one in which we are able to put a number to the concept that we want to measure, we can then go on to translating our research question into hypotheses. Now, I started off by saying, let's consider the prevalence of depression in CISO members. So the prevalence is a descriptive study. So you're describing what the prevalence of depression is among CISO members. But what if you wanted to know if a difference exists within CISO between the different registration categories that you have in South Africa for psychologists? So let's use the 6 registration categories that we have for psychologists in South Africa as an example. So we have the clinical psychologists, counseling psychologists, educational psychologists, industrial psychologists, research psychologists, and neuropsychologists. So those 6 categories, and you want to know, out of those 6 categories, is there any difference between any of the categories? So now you have a question about differences. And here you would then have to come up with your research question. Two of my colleagues are in the audience will remember me talking about this way back when they were still undergrad. Your research question, sorry, now I lost my train of thought. I'm completely distracted by the fact that Dr. Naima Talib and Dr. Fawa Ismail is in the audience. But yeah, I wasn't expecting to see them here today. So coming back to your hypotheses. So your research question in most instances translates into your alternative hypothesis. So research hypotheses or statistical hypotheses have 2 parts. An alternative hypothesis, and then the null hypothesis that gets tested statistically. So if you look at differences, your research question in this case are the differences between the psychologists' research categories in terms of their level of depression. Then your research question translates into alternative hypothesis. So in other words, the alternative hypothesis would be that there are differences between the different registration categories in terms of the level of depression. You then also have a null hypothesis, which is the opposite of the alternate, in that you would say there are no differences between the registration categories of psychologists in terms of their levels of depression. So translating your research question in most instances translates directly into your alternative hypothesis, which says there is a difference. But you also may have an hypothesis, a research question that translates into your null hypothesis. That, for example, you would say that your question might be that there are no differences between men and women in terms of levels of depression. So your research is trying to show that there isn't any difference between men and women in terms of depression. And so that then would translate directly into your null hypothesis, because it is stated in a null way. But I'm not going to go into too much detail about that. Okay, so now we have a research question about differences. You may also have a research question about association. So your research question on depression might be that your level of depression is related to income. So you would say your research question might be that the higher your income, the lower your level of depression. So you would say that would be a directional hypothesis, because you're saying that your research question is stated in the positive that as your income increases, your levels of depression decreases, which, by the way, isn't true. But that's your research question. So you would then have a association question. And so you want to state in your research question the direction, or you can state no direction. So you can either say that as income increases, depression decreases, or you can say that income is related to depression, and not state whether it is, which direction it is. And in most instances, in fact, I advise all my students that you should try to steer away from directional hypotheses if you aren't 100% certain that the direction of the hypothesis has been shown in previous research and will be true for your sample. And if we have time, we'll talk about sampling a bit later. So there are a number of two ways in which we generally ask research questions quantitatively. The first is when we compare groups. And here we're looking at any pre-existing groups, usually, in the social sciences, unless we are doing a experimental design. And we'll talk, if I have time, I'll talk more about that. But so when we compare variables, the example I just gave is the one variable is income and the other variable is depression. Then we need to do at least a correlation where we look at your income versus your level of depression and see whether there is a correlation. And correlation, by the way, doesn't give you anything other than how straight the line is when you do a scatter plot between the two variables. If you want to say how much influence the one variable has over the other, we need to do a regression analysis, which will give us the amount of shared variance between the two variables. So if you want to predict levels of depression with income, then you would need to do a regression analysis, and that will give you the amount of shared variance between income and levels of depression. If you just want to see whether there's an association, you would do a correlation. So the other type of research we often do in the social sciences is comparing either pre-existing groups or creating groups ourselves. So in this example that I've given, we use pre-existing groups, the registration categories for psychologists. The other way in which we compare groups is by creating those groups ourselves, and that's with experimental design. So there are a number of different types of experimental design. And I'm going to talk about, excuse me, I'm going to talk about for 11 types of research design. 3 that are called pre-experimental, 4 that are called quasi-experimental, and 4 that are called experimental. I'm going to leave you to read up on pre-experimental and quasi-experimental types, and I want to talk about experimental types of research. So in experimental research, we have 4 kinds of experiments that we do. We have a pre-test, post-test control group design. We have a post-test only control group design. We have the Solomon 4 group design, and we have a factorial design, which is which the Solomon 4 group design is. It's a factorial design. So in experimental designs, there are 2 things that are key to conducting an experiment. The one is a randomization, and that is when we identify the entire group of subjects, in this case CISA members, and then randomly divide the group into 2 or more subgroups by a systematic random technique. So it's important here to distinguish between random selection and random assignment, in other words, randomization. So random selection is where you have a full list of all the members of CISA, and you use either a table of random numbers, or these days you can just do it on the internet. Give the number, say there's 100, that there are 100 people in your population, and you'd like to randomly select 20, and on the internet you'll get a random set of 20 numbers. So that's random selection. Random assignment is when you, in other words, randomization is where you randomly assign people to one of two groups. One that receives an intervention and one that doesn't receive the intervention. So in the first example, the pre-test, post-test control group design, you have subjects that are randomly assigned to two groups, the control group and the experimental group. You measure both groups at the beginning of the study in terms of the level of depression. So we said 6 categories. So we've randomly assigned them to 6 categories. We measure all 6 categories before the study for the level of depression. And then we have randomization into experimental and control groups in each of those categories. So, and yeah, moving into factorial design. So within each category, you would have an experimental group and a control group. And the experimental group will then receive the treatment or event or workshop or whatever it is. So you have a measurement before, you have an intervention, half your study gets the intervention, the other half are the control group and don't get that, and then both groups are again measured after. You can then either compare you need to compare the pre-test scores, and if the pre-test scores show no statistical difference, then you know randomization has occurred. And if you then compare the post-test scores and there is a difference, you can then say that the intervention had an effect. But you can also compare for the experimental group their pre-test versus post-test scores, and for the control group their pre and post-test scores. So I'm looking at the time. So I'm not going to go through the rest of those types of experimental designs. What I want to get to more importantly is how do we end up designing your research? So depending on your question, you would need to use a research design that will answer that question. So the majority of research conducted in psychology in South Africa tends not to be experimental design, because we need a better understanding, in my opinion, of what the social reality is for many people in South Africa, rather than putting people into an experiment and looking at differences. Not that there's anything less worthy about doing an experiment. In my opinion, I think we still need to know what the lay of the land looks like before we can actually go and do our experiments. But so I spoke earlier a little bit earlier about comparing groups and comparing variables. And I want to talk about 2 types of comparing groups and comparing variables. One where you have one dependent variable, and the other where you have more than one dependent variable. So if, for example, you have, I'm going to move away from depression, and I'm going to use a few other examples. So when you have one dependent variable, and you're comparing 2 groups in terms, of the one dependent variable, let's say intelligence. You want to see whether men and women differ in terms of their levels of intelligence. Your research design then would involve a cross-sectional research design. So cross-sectional research design is the type of research design where we look at how things are at a particular moment in time. If you think of cutting down a tree, trees have these annular rings, and you can see how old a tree is by counting the number of rings. So it's at that particular moment in time. And if you cut a tree at its base, you'll be able to see all of the rings from when the tree was a very young tree to where it is now. The higher you move, let's use the example of a pine tree. The higher you move up a pine tree, the thinner the pine tree becomes. If you do a cross-sectional cut there and you look at the rings will tell you that that part of the tree is younger because there are less rings. So cross-sectional research design is the majority of the types of studies that we do in South Africa. So coming back to comparing groups. So you have men and women, and you want to see whether they differ in terms of intelligence. And then the most appropriate test will be a t-test. I was told there will be another talk like this where you'll be talking about the statistics, but I'm wanting to just quickly go through what you would do in terms of cross-sectional research, the types of things that you would answer. So if you have, as I said, one dependent variable, and in this instance, let's just use stress. If stress is your dependent variable and you're looking at Edgar's, and you want to see whether at Edgar's, the management, salespeople, and clerical people differ in terms of stress, you would use an ANOVA. If you have two dependent variables when comparing groups, and there is more than two levels, you would use a MANOVA. An ANOVA being for analysis of variance, and the MANOVA just stands for multivariate analysis of variance. I'm not going to go into any more detail there. When you have one dependent variable and you're comparing variables, so here we're looking at income and depression, you would do a correlation, and that would tell you whether the relationship exists. And if you wanted to see whether income predicts depression, you would do a regression analysis. And these would all fall under cross-sectional research design. However, and when you're looking at more than one dependent variable, you would do multiple regression if you have one dependent variable and more than one independent variable. And then finally, when you have more than one dependent variable, so depression and anxiety, and you have a number of variables that are independent, you will do a multivariate multiple regression. But you'll cover that when you do the one on statistics. So I spoke about cross-sectional research design. The other way we look at research design in terms of time is longitudinal design. And here, the experimental design is a form of longitudinal design. You have a pre-test, you have an intervention, and then a post-test. Yes, Hasina?
Not sure if
Hasina, your hand was up. Sorry.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now. You were muted.
I was just wondering, oh, sorry about that. If we have something like depression, you spoke about pretest, post-test, and control and experimental group. So now if psychologists want to work with the same group of people, say one of the groups, and do life skills or something in between, like an intervention, then what is that design called? Because then we're going to check what's happening, the result of the intervention on the control and the other experimental group.
So that's a pre-experimental design where you don't have a control group. And it would just be called the pre-test, post-test design. And it's not an experimental study, it would be a pre-experimental study because it doesn't have a control group for you to compare to. So there are many factors that may influence how people's level of depression. So it may be that the person has lost a loved one recently and is grieving and is in a state of, has a depressive episode. And so therefore, as time progresses, that level of depression becomes less. And that's not due to anything other than the fact that time has passed. And so it's a pre-experimental design because we can't control for the change of, over time. And the example I usually use here is the September 11 attack on the Twin Towers in New York City. If you had to measure anxiety on September the 9th, 2001 in New York, and you had an intervention on September the 10th, and then on the 15th of September, you tested again to measure levels of anxiety. There would have been an event that happened outside of the control of the individual. So that's a thing called history. So history has happened and had an effect on your concept that you're measuring. So it is often used, but it's one of the less rigorous forms of experimental design.
Okay. Okay, I'm trying to understand. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. So where was I? In terms of time, yes. So for an experimental design, you have the concept of time, but then you also have longitudinal studies, and there are a number of types of longitudinal studies. One of which is if you know Professor Linda Richter from the UKZN, she's the principal investigator on a study that was called Birth to 20. You can Google it. They followed children who were born at Johannesburg General Hospital. Forget which year it started. But they followed them for their first 20 years of their life. Their clinic appointments, their academic achievements, their first pregnancies, etc., etc. So that's a longitudinal study where you follow a particular group over a long period of time. You have a cohort that you then use, that you follow for a particular period of time. The other type of longitudinal study which is not often used is one where you do a tracer study. So you would look at psychologists who were registered as research psychologists in 2010. You'd get a full list of those. And then now 2022, you would then do essentially a cross-sectional research study on the number of publications. It doesn't really fall under the longitudinal design, but in terms of the idea of the concept of time and research, the tracer study traces people after a certain period of time to see what's happening with that particular group. Many of the theses and dissertations and articles that I review lack the concept of time because, number one, it's costly, number two, it's time consuming. And so there aren't very many studies that do that, that aren't externally funded. So most masters and PhD students, the majority of them would end up doing some form of cross-sectional research. And more's the pity. We need to not just know what's happening at a particular time, but how that's changed over time is very important in my opinion. Then the other thing in terms of time, in terms of the research design is the unit of analysis. So in terms of your unit of analysis in your study, is your unit of analysis an individual, or is it an organization, or is it well, I guess a sports team would fall under an organization as well. So your unit of analysis in psychology tends to be individuals, groups of individuals about which we then make decisions. But there's a concern about your unit of analysis where the data from that unit, although it only describes that individual, if you're looking at individual level, if you combine it with similar data collected from a group of similar people, then the data provides an accurate picture of the group to which the unit belongs. So if we are concerned about research psychologists, our unit of analysis is individuals, but when we bring all of those together, we can then make a decision about the group. However, we need to be careful of ecological fallacy. And an ecological fallacy is when conclusions are drawn about one unit of analysis, and in actual fact, the research focus on a different one. So we're looking at research psychologists, and we made a conclusion about this group, but then we want to draw a conclusion about an individual in that group based on this research. So, for example, the easy example is, let's say the average number of publications for research psychologists from 2010 to 2022 is 3 per year. And so you then meet a research psychologist and you expect that person to have published 3 papers that year. That would be the ecological fallacy coming into play, where you're making a decision about an individual, when in fact the research was conducted on the group. So there are several possible units of analysis: individuals, as I said, groups of people. So here we're looking at studies of identical twins, marital relationships, and so on. We can look at organizations. We can look at employees, for example, or the different levels of employees. We spoke about time. We can look at a systematic change in infant mortality in a given community over a 20-year period, for example. Or we could have social artifacts as a unit of analysis. And that could be stuff like poems, letters, income, IQ levels, those are all social artifacts. And if you're interested in IQ, there's very interesting research that's shown that the IQ scores of people have been increasing over the last few decades. And as a result, Mensa, MENSA, is a group that purports to have people of genius level. They've increased the number that you need to get on the IQ score to be part of their organization. But that's beside the point. I'm looking at time and I'm wondering if there are any questions because nobody else has asked questions.
I wanted to ask, can one do a cross-sectional study that is descriptive in orientation?
Yes. Yes, you can. This is a short answer. So you want to describe the average income of a research psychologist in 2022. That would be cross-sectional. It would be 2022, and you're describing the average income. You could also then describe the median, the mode, the standard deviation, and all of the other descriptive statistics that one can run. So it would be cross-sectional. Generally, if you're doing research that is not cross-sectional, that has a time component to it, it tends not to be descriptive. You'd be looking for change if you're looking at time. Any other questions?
So just to clarify, this cross-sectional study doesn't have, or doesn't dictate the type of analysis or type of hypothesis.
No, no.
It's just a period of time. So you're saying it's cross-sectional because you're doing it at this point in time.
Yes.
Okay.
That's correct. So you can have a descriptive study as cross-sectional. You can have a comparative study where you're looking at different groups at a particular point in time. You can have a regression study where you're trying to predict a particular thing at a certain point in time.
Okay.
So that was why I said earlier that the time component in research in South Africa generally is under researched.
So just to clarify, you said that if you wanted to find out how people feel, or what was it that you had said? When you were asking about what type of questions can we answer with quantitative questions, and you said that you can't ask how does it feel like to live with depression. So are you saying that you can't measure experiences from a quantitative perspective?
You can't, in my opinion, you can't measure with a number the lived experience of someone.
Okay, lived experience, but you can measure experience. Do you get bullied? Don't you get bullied?
Yes.
So
Yes.
there's I think philosophically you have to differentiate between whether the experience is the lived experience or whether the person has experienced it or not.
Yes.
Because I think some people think when you, in the title, when you say the experiences of cyberbullying amongst UNIVEN students, then you can't measure experience, and then so some people would say you can't have the word experience in your title, but you're not measuring the lived experience. You're measuring, has this person been bullied or not been bullied, which is their experience. Not so.
I'm going to disagree with you on that.
Okay.
Because for me, that's not you were looking at the levels of bullying. So how often, or the prevalence of bullying. And so it might seem like semantics, but you're not. Yes, you're doing descriptive analysis of the number of times people have been bullied, how many times they've experienced bullying.
Okay.
But you're not looking at their experience of bullying. You're looking at the prevalence
Okay.
of bullying.
So in
that
terms
account?
of semantics, how would you phrase it?
Say again.
In terms of semantics, how would you then phrase it? What is the prevalence of cyberbullying?
Yes.
Okay. And you leave out the word experience.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Dr. Talib is saying perhaps exposure. Bullying.
So, okay. Just to round up, thank you so much, Shukran, Jazakallah, thank you, Nuribuati, all the different languages that I have come across. Thank you so much for the lovely presentation. I think from a student's perspective, you have really provided the foundation to build on for whatever it is that they do decide to do moving forward in the quantitative or qualitative research careers. We had a lovely turnout with over 41 people attending, some people coming and going, so the numbers does differ when you download the attendance register. Thank you to all the people in the audience today and Dr. Mapura, who is one of our DRM members, executive members. And thank you for all the participants and attendees. We really appreciate you. And to Dr. Kafad, thank you so much. Shukran, Jazakallah, for doing the presentation. We really look forward to working with you in the future. And we hope that we can do more of these types of webinars moving forward.
It's the greatest of pleasure, and I look forward to doing more of these if you would have me.
That definitely. So yes, that's it from SAISA for today. Please, there is an evaluation form link that I have posted earlier on. Let me just copy and paste the copy link, paste the link. I opened the link, paste. Please, if you can fill in the SAISA evaluation form. Additionally, we would like to do some marketing. SAISA has a YouTube channel and a Facebook channel, and we would like you, if you are not yet a member, to please join us. We communicate all previous and forthcoming webinars, so yeah, please join us and please complete the evaluation form so that we know what the needs of our community is so that we can address those needs moving forward and plan accordingly. It's 1 o'clock now, but Dr. Ghaffar, we have a question from Solomon. He's asking, what informs the operational definition?
So your conceptual definition. Sorry, let me finish this. I was just busy typing something. I thought I was done. So your conceptual definition defines or informs what your operational definition is. So whatever your concept is, we use the example of hopelessness, helplessness, sadness, loss of pleasure in things you used to do in the past. Then your operational definition needs to say how you're going to measure all of those things. So how are you going to measure helplessness, hopelessness, sadness? How are you going to measure loss of pleasure in things you used to do? So you need to be able to apply a number to it. And that's how you create your operational definition.
Okay. Dr. Khafa, just to mention, there is a question by Naima Talib asking if it's possible that you could remain on. Yes, the only challenge is that This is on my Teams
No, no,
channel,
no,
and if
sorry.
I'm not here, I'm not going to be able. You won't be able to continue on this link. So
That's
maybe
fine.
you can
Yes,
just
no, that I'm
organize.
sorry. I meant to send that to Dr. Talib and Dr. Ismail.
Okay,
And it ended up being in this chat. Sorry, my confusion. I completely understand what you're saying. I
okay,
meant that to be a private message. Sorry.
okay, no problem. But yes, that concludes today's presentation. Shukran, Dr. Kafat, for today, and thank you, esteemed students and fellow researchers, doctors that's on the platform today. It was lovely having you all. Bye.
Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for giving me the opportunity. Bye-bye.